Now, Dr. Elst would be talking about the Changers Club, first publication, Ram Swarup's Indictment of the Quit India Leadership.
Yeah.
Now, as we have introduced him in the morning, so I request Dr. Elst to please share his thoughts on the same.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here we go. So Ram Swarupji started his writing life pretty early, in his early 20s. So we know his later work, and we might expect to be surprised once in a while when we go through his earlier work. His very first publication was called An Indictment, namely of the leadership of the Quit India movement. You see, let's introduce Ram Swarup first for those who don't know him. So he was born in Sonipat, also in Haryana, like GOEL, in 1920. So last year we celebrated his centenary. So he was a witty intellectual, therefore also fairly popular and influential. And so in his 20s, he was a progressive. He was, I wouldn't say anti-religious, but certainly skeptical of religion. Like the manifesto of the Changers Club, oh yeah, which we still have to introduce, but that manifesto said, butter is more important than God. So that was very trendy. And something that most people don't know about Ram Swarup, and it even counts to quite an extent for SITARAM GOEL, is the very decisive influence of British leftism, not really Marxism, but, you know, something halfway, like people like Bertrand Russell, the great, mathematician and philosopher, but also known as a pacifist, an anti-war campaigner, Aldous Huxley, George Bernard Shaw, or George Orwell. In fact, I can testify, see, they knew all the anecdotes about these writers. Like, for instance, George Bernard Shaw was a friend of G.K. Chesterton, a conservative philosopher. And so they had sort of a love-hate relationship. And Chesterton was very fat and Shaw was very thin. And so, you know, famous anecdote is where Chesterton, you know, looks at the thin frame of Shaw and says, when they see you, they will think there's a famine. And then Shaw looked at the heavy frame of Chesterton and said, yeah, and if they say you, they know why there is a famine. So, you know, that kind of, you know, stuff that was alive in British circles, you see, they were totally conversant with this. And so that's a major influence on them. Like, for example, I've noted when this pretty offensive anti-Hindu book came out by Wendy Doniger in, it became news in 2014, but the book is a bit older. Then very many Hindus argued that, yeah, they should be banned. You know, they said things like, yeah, but freedom of speech does not mean freedom to insult. Well, you see, George Orwell famously said, well, if freedom of speech doesn't mean the freedom to say things that people don't want to hear, then it doesn't mean much. And so that was the attitude of Ram Swarup and SITARAM GOEL also. You know, to them, of course, there should be freedom of speech. And in the end, Hinduism will only profit from it. And Hinduism has a great debating tradition, you know, of Yajnavalkya and Shankara and so on. And so if Hindus right now don't feel confident in a debate, well, it is time to update their debating skills, but certainly not to go for repression. Anyway, so they had that spirit of British liberalism throughout their lives. Now, in 1944, he founded a little debating society, namely the Changers Club. Now, actually, this wasn't meant to be just a debating society, because it is, in fact, the name is a quip, an allusion to the statement of Marx that philosophers have always described the world, but the thing to do is to change it. All right, so they were going to do more than philosophers, namely change the world. But so essentially nothing came of that. It was just another talking shop, though perhaps, you know, witty and interesting and so on, but nevertheless a talking shop. Though it included a number of people that at that time were only students or, you know, just beginning life, but who became pretty important in Indian history, like a diplomat L.C. Jain, Girilal Jain, who was the editor of Times of India, which is the most prestigious paper in India. You know, as he himself would say, I am the second most important man in India after the Prime Minister. Then the economist Raj Krishna. He was the author of a phrase that perhaps is still heard, namely the characterization of a very slow economy as the Hindu rate of growth. You see, when the Nehruvian socialists were completely failing in their economic policies and making India into a proverbial synonym of extreme poverty, they shifted the blame to Hinduism. They pretended it was not their own policies who brought this poverty, but that it was somehow a Hindu tradition to celebrate poverty. And indeed, that approach had a certain credibility because of the character of Mahatma Gandhi, who always celebrated poverty and misery. So many outside people, you know, tended to equate Gandhi with Hinduism. And so, you know, he could get away with this. It is GOEL himself who documented how this term came about. And so it would have been more properly called the Nehru rate of growth. Then there is the philosophy professor Daya Krishna. I like him very much. He wrote this book about Vedic philosophy, where he takes a middle ground between two extremes. One is the Western view of, skepticism vis-a-vis Vedic thought, which Max Muller, for instance, characterized as very puerile. And on the other hand, the Hindu traditionalists who extol and divinize the Vedas. You know, he had a very realistic, down-to-earth view of it, but still extolling the Vedas as a unique human achievement, which, I mean, I entirely agree with that position. And then we have our own SITARAM GOEL. Yes, another person, I don't think she was a formal member, but she was in that circle, is Kapila Vatsyayana. She told me herself. In fact, I had last year, I had hoped to still include her testimony in the Ram Swarup Centenary Conference. So I offered her to, you know, to come to her place to record something because she was already ailing very much, but unfortunately she died too early. And the same thing, in fact, counts for the present conference. I would have liked to, I mean, that's what I thought of a few years ago, of bringing in Mukund Laat. He was a language professor and a good friend of SITARAM GOEL, and also acknowledged by SITARAM GOEL as a major influence on him. But he too left us. Anyway, so the Changers Club also started publishing some pamphlets, and I really mean pamphlets, you know, the one we're talking about today is 17 pages. But still, it already gives a good idea of where Ram Swarup was then and where he was going for the rest of his life. So Daya Krishna was the editor of the series. In fact, at the moment, we don't even know how many publications there were. We have a few. Of a few, we know the existence, and maybe there are more. And so after Ram Swarup's death, his family donated all his works to a library in Sonipat, his hometown. And so now I've been trying to retrieve it, but with Corona and so on, all this has been postponed. So this is one of our next projects. Like, for instance, there is one about the murder of Mahatma Gandhi. It's very interesting because he was a very active Gandhian at one point. Also, after the murder, he was the personal secretary of Mira Behen, who was a confidant of Gandhi in his last years. But so he himself told me what was in this booklet. GOEL also gave his own version, but I've never seen the physical copy of this. That would be valuable. Anyway, so Daya Krishna, he edited, and so he thought that the Indian population was troubled with shallowness and ignorance, and his own pamphlet series would do something about that, being both informative and interpretative. And it should be a guide for Indian politics to become more rational and national, in the sense that it is of nationalist tendency, as we shall see. So, yes, one more thing that has to be mentioned here about Daya Krishna's foreword to the very, very first pamphlet in the series. You see, he starts with a remark that is still valid and that is very important to understand Indian politics in general, and Ram Swarup's and SITARAM GOEL's work in particular. Namely, hero worship is a general characteristic of Indian life, and nowhere more so than in politics. Ignorance of facts, colossal both in depth and extent, is the cardinal reason for it. You know, this hero worship, look no further than today. You see, today on social media, you find plenty of discussion of what to do with Narendra Modi. I mean, how to judge him. And so many Hindus are very disappointed. They say, well, he's a fairly good administrator, like he handled the Corona crisis fairly well, after all. You know, his economics policy is perhaps not the best. It's certainly better than the Congress government's. Is scaling down corruption is quite successful. His sanitation policy, of course, is spectacular. So in terms of development, he's a pretty good administrator. But in terms of Hindu politics, he's just nowhere. He has done nothing for the Hindus specifically. Now, many other Hindus and Hindu activists who would indeed say the same thing of a Congress Prime Minister if he behaved like this, suddenly start defending Modi in this regard and start inventing all kinds of reasons why pro-Hindu policies are impossible or undesirable. Why? Well, hero worship. You see, they have long ago chosen for Modi, and now they remain loyal to Modi, whatever he does. So you see, many serious discussions about policies, about what should be done, are thwarted by this blind hero worship. There is a proverb in the West, it's often ascribed to Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the American president, though that attribution is wrong. But it says this: great minds focus on ideas, mediocre minds on events, and small minds on persons. So you see, this tendency of hero worship can be linked with the third element, small minds focus on persons. You see, if the idea is to further Hindu interests, then Modi is a great failure. But you see, if you like Modi, well, there is much about him to like. You know, he's a clean person. He's a, you know, he works enormously, and at the same time he has a certain asceticism about him and so on. He's great. Nevertheless, in terms of political ideas and how he realizes them, he's also a failure. These two things can go together in one human being, and so it's a matter of simplifying things if you only see the person. And so, you know, hero worship is a problem on many occasions, but here you have a very important, very consequential example right in front of you. At that time, of course, hero worship concerned the Congress leaders, Nehru, but very especially Mahatma Gandhi. Now, the first pamphlet was called An Indictment, Whose Responsibility for the Failure of 1942? 1942, August 1942, is the time of the Quit India movement, when the followers of Mahatma Gandhi rose to demand that the British immediately vacate India. And as you know, they didn't. So, you know, already if you know only that, you can already say, yes, this movement was a failure. It was also a failure in other respects. It didn't live up to its own promises. Mahatma Gandhi had wanted to keep the movement non-violent, or at least non-violent against people, because, you know, sabotaging acts, that's a form of violence, even if you try not to hurt people. And then, you know, ultimately that doesn't work, because if you sabotage railways, well, what about the next train that's going to be derailed? What about the people in there? If you attack, I don't know, a military telegraph line, for example, a very peaceful thing, but, you know, it's a perfect object for sabotage. Well, therefore, the army is going to protect it. It's going to, you know, use sentries to keep an eye on what happens. And so you're going to run into them, you're going to have a fight, there's going to be killing. Do you, as a Mahatma of non-violence, take responsibility for the killing that's going to ensue? And so in terms of strict non-violence, you know, I hope that the people all over the world who are teaching classes about how Gandhi and non-violence made India independent, that they don't look too deeply into the history of the Quit India movement. Right, but so that's not a failure that Ram Swarup meant. He meant specifically the political failure. It did not achieve India's independence. And indeed, it didn't change very much in India. You see, he says, and this is he writes this at the end of the war, and so he notices that countries that have even never been occupied, like England, or that have just been liberated, like France, trying to get their whole thing together again, find that they have irrevocably changed. That, for instance, the class relations in Britain have changed, you know, to the disadvantage of the upper classes. And then in the ex-colonies, or in the colonies at the time, a national awakening has taken place, or, you know, other things have changed. Whereas he says in India, nothing has changed. I don't know if that's a fair assessment. You see, that was still in the middle of the events. It was perhaps too early to make a general assessment of that. At any rate, in this booklet, the editor acknowledges that it has a very sharp, bitter tone. And so this is partly explained by the fact that Ram Swarup was in the middle of it. He was an activist for Quit India. And so he started with his hopes up, and then nothing came of it. and he saw at close quarters how the leadership failed. So this tendency is whitewashed by Dayakrishna when he says, if the presentation seems unnecessarily bitter, we can only say, failures are a luxury we cannot afford to repeat. Or as they say at NASA, failure is not an option. Okay, the motto of the booklet, also printed on the front page, not because the people failed it, but because the leaders failed it. Because as he will show, and as he himself experienced, the activists were very brave and very dedicated and so on, but they did not have good guidance. And so he calls the result a criminal mess up and fiasco. So the field commanders, the leaders on the ground, not the top leaders, they performed very well. Like one name that became very important in Indian politics later is Jaya Prakash Narayan. Another is Aruna Asaf Ali. For older ones among you might remember that she was the first mayor of Delhi after independence. Now, she was, of course, sought by the British, so she went underground. And during that period, Ram Swarup served as her post box, that is to say, her overground contact. So now let's go into what Ram Swarup says. So when the Congress leaders discussed the action that Gandhiji contemplated, they made a resolution, and the first point was a demand to the British government to clear out. That's why the whole thing was summarized as quit India. The whole discussion had an utter unreality about it, which is characteristic of the Congress leadership. As they discussed and made this demand on paper, they assumed that their demand was already conceded. I must say that I myself have been a witness to a similar display of this Hindu lack of realism. This was the California textbook affair in 2005-2006, where the Hindus were going to have the textbooks of school in school amended to give a more favorable picture of Hinduism, which till then was always derided as the holy cow and so on. And so among the amendments that they proposed was that the Aryan invasion theory has been discarded. Nobody believes in it anymore. Now, I warned them against this. You see, if you do this, they're going to react. And even the good amendments that you propose are not going to come through because of this, because of association with this blatantly false statement. And so they thought they knew better and so on. So they lost. They lost completely. Then they went to court where they also lost. Then appeals court where they also lost. They spent $40,000 for the pursuit of a completely lost case. Because if you look into the facts, of course, the Aryan invasion theory has not been discarded. Yes, it has been disproven among us, you know, in our echo chamber, but it has not been discarded. And it's not so difficult to find out about that. So you see, that was this lack of realism that once in a while I do find in Hindu circles. I don't know about other circles, but, you know, here I you know, run into it once in a while. So precisely because they thought that there was nothing to do, they also didn't outline what to do. Quote, they did not consider how best to execute this demand, to effect it and make it good. On the other hand, they assumed that this demand had been conceded. And they were terror-stricken at such a possibility. because if it happened, then other things would follow. That's my next item. But at any rate, they did not think that this demand would have to be fought for by them. They thought it had to be conceded by the British, inevitably. And so in this context, he quotes Nehru. So you see, if the British withdraw, then what is the problem? You see, this movement was for immediate withdrawal by the British, yet among the high command of Congress, there were also some people who were not so sure whether they really wanted the British to leave. And so if there is no unity of purpose, then success is very unlikely. So Nehru said, withdrawal of troops and the whole apparatus of civil administration will create a vacuum which cannot be filled up immediately. You see, this is still the time of the war. The Japanese troops are in Burma. They're about to enter India. And so to immediately jump into independence and immediately take military initiatives of that proportion, that is indeed quite a challenge. And so Nehru cites that as a reason to postpone the whole idea of British withdrawal. After a quote of Nehru, perhaps I should explain why I titled this page Humbug versus Action. There is a book about the 20th century or something history by the British historian Paul Johnson. And so when it comes to Nehru, he is, of course, very dismissive of Nehru's performance as a prime minister. But he admits that there is one thing that Nehru is very, very, very good at. Namely, and I quote, holding forth on the higher humbug. So that's a characterization of the rhetoric of Jawaharlal Nehru. And so here also, it was a great display of words in order to prevent action or the need for action. He proposed a course where any dramatic initiatives would be superfluous. According to Ram Swarup, the real reason why they were so ignominiously stampeding at the prospect of such a frightful possibility as a British withdrawal from India did not lie in any real terror of such a situation, but in the fact that the leadership had no tradition of responsibility. They were afraid of snatching it because they were afraid of exercising it. They were only talkative, not knowing. They were merely good at essay writing in the form of pious resolutions and quite incapable of any organized, sustained, and purposive action. Well, you see, whatever else we're going to say about this pamphlet, this, I think, is a very correct assessment of Congress politicians at that stage of history. It is perhaps to some extent forgivable because these men had been in the opposition all their lives. If you never ever get any experience of administration, well, this is where you end up. You write fine speeches and you can become ever better in the art of writing fine speeches, but, you never get any hands-on experience. So that's where they were. Nehru was famously an internationalist. Like when in 1947-48, the Kashmir crisis took place, the Indian Army was in the process of reconquering the lost territory, was, almost on the point of driving out the Pakistani invaders. And then Nehru stopped them and he went to the United Nations, internationalizing the issue. Because you see, he wanted to set an example of peace and internationalism. So he stopped the military. Well, well. This is one of his many Himalayan blunders. And you see, that was already foreseen before he even became prime minister, because Ram Swarup writes here, before independence, Jawaharlal, the worst bungler of our politics, said, "This approach is contrary to the Congress policy for the last 2 years and a half," meaning the time of the war. "The Allied countries will have a feeling that we are enemies." Now here he makes a point somewhat different from what we've been discussing just now, namely that since the war started, the Indians have effectively had an alliance with their British overlords. They were also participating in the Second World War on the side of the British, which was not obvious. You see, they could have chosen another course, which is what Subhash Chandra Bose did. He fought with the Germans, then with the Japanese. But so two important leaders advised the Indians to take service in the British Army, namely the Muslim League with Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Hindu Mahasabha led by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. In the case of the Muslim League, it was mainly to curry favor with the British, to better their political position, jockeying for position, so that they would be well placed to achieve their real political aim, which was partition at the time of independence. In the case of Savarkar, it was mainly, he thought that inevitably there would come a moment of military confrontation with the British. And so he thought, this is the best way for the Hindus to achieve, to acquire military experience. Anyway, so very many, millions of Indians fought on the British side. And so Congress did not formally join hands with the British, because the British did not give a clear undertaking that in return for your help in the war, we're going to give you independence afterwards, which was perhaps a sensible position. That's certainly not what I want to criticize. Anyway, so Nehru says here that, we've had this alliance, and so if we now turn against the British, unless they concede independence immediately, then the other allied countries are going to have the impression that we are their enemies. And indeed, at a human level, the policy of being friends even with your enemies is a correct one. That's a more humane attitude. And with that, there is nothing wrong. But nevertheless, politically, they remain your adversaries. They want the opposite of what you want. They want to stay in India, whereas you want independence. And so there is a tension between these two facts, and it's a sign of political talent if you know how to reconcile them. And so if Gandhi had been a little bit wiser than he was, maybe he could have pulled it off. But anyway, here, what we see here is a confusion between these two levels. And so Nehru is too absolutist about treating the British as friends, or at least that's what Ram Swarup, that's the point he makes here. Then, you see this internationalism of Nehru, this concern about what the Allies will think of us, this idea of putting the World War first and independence for India later, that showed a certain unconcern about the national interest. Though, in this case, I would be able to defend the Nehruvian position, to say that, first, this war is so important, first we have to finish this war, then the rest. And I think if you look at this with hindsight, but this is written only just at the end of the war, if you look at it with hindsight, something could be said for, the idea that this war against Nazism, against Japanese imperialism has to be won. Like at that time, for instance, the Holocaust was not known at all. See, Hitler was just, for many Hindus, Hitler was a vegetarian, a celibate, because nobody knew, the German propaganda kept this a secret that he had a mistress, Eva Braun. And, he glorified the swastika, which is also very dear to the hearts of Hindus and Buddhists. So at that time, this demonization of Nazism wasn't there yet, or to the extent that it was there, it was associated with British propaganda, and the British were the enemies. So that didn't carry much weight. And so if the magnitude of this world war had been realized, maybe he would have taken a different position. Don't know yet. I mean, or don't know at all. Forever unknown. Anyway, so according to Ram Swarup, the readers fail to appreciate the magnitude of the problem, the broad sweep of strategy, the intensity of the struggle ahead, the national urgency of fighting out the issue, and the inspired impatience to win the battle. Not the battle against the Axis powers, but the battle against colonization, against the British. While they, the politicians, stood either for moral cant or for political fashion, none of them stood for Indian freedom. And so they spoke a lot about humanity. What about the 400 million Indian part of humanity? Were they not part of democratic humanity for which the leadership was fighting? And they were fighting for it exclusively with undivided loyalty. They were for humanity, not a little bit also for India. And that's the point he's making. So the Indian cause was an orphan, at best an accidental side issue. Then another critique which he formulates of the leadership, and that could apply to most politicians in most places. They are not equal to the responsibility of a nation's leadership. They can neither read history, nor take advantage of it, nor shape it, nor listen, follow, and respect those who can. This is a very familiar problem, like Indira Gandhi had it, like now, of course, I would say Narendra Modi very clearly has it. They do not surround themselves with capable people. They often, this is an ego issue. They want to shine in their circle, so they don't want anyone to shine, anyone else to shine. At any rate, they did give evidence of a rather compromised understanding of their situation. Though, again, I repeat, if you look at it with hindsight, maybe they had a slightly better case than Ram Swarup allows for here. We have seen how hopelessly the Congress mind was confused. They had no idea of the goal they wanted to reach, except that everyone was allowed to paint his or her own picture of it and invest it with all the glories and colors of which he or she was capable. I interrupt here. This is still part of Congress culture till today, even though the challenges are not, of the magnitude of a Second World War. But one difference that media people have observed between the BJP and Congress is the way they treat their intellectuals. You see, those who favor the BJP, they are treated in a very regimented fashion. You have to sort of toe the party line. And whereas in Congress, you have to remain loyal to the dynasty, the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. But otherwise, you have a lot of freedom as long as you don't turn hostile to Congress many things go. They're more relaxed about this. You see, the BJP more has this RSS attitude of uniforms and, following the rules. So, so in far more serious circumstances, the Congress displayed that same attitude. And so there it meant that people could have many different opinions about what exactly had to be done. Now, even if there was no unity about the goal, at any rate, there was no unity about how to reach the goal. And so non-violence was popular, and people intoned the slogan of non-violence without necessarily remaining non-violent when it became difficult. Then others were fighting for internationalism, like Nehru, or what is temptingly but vaingloriously called humanity. You see, here he takes the nationalist viewpoint, which many nationalists the world over have expressed, that there is no such thing as humanity. There are French human beings and Russian human beings and Indian human beings and so on. There is no such thing as humanity. That's an abstraction. So, moreover, this word humanity, according to Ram Swarup, was used by the unimaginative and mentally dull section of Congress as British humanity. You see, they talked about humanity whenever they wanted to justify a compromise with the British, while others wanted to vindicate their natural, inalienable birthright of freedom before the bar of the world, which generally meant America. Yeah, I mean, there was, of course, limitations in the worldview of Congress leaders, but then that counts. And then a totally different angle. You see, this Quit India movement was something of a revolution. It was challenging the existing power structure. So I call this Inkilab Zindabad, which was a slogan during the Soviet Revolution. In the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks wanted to use the ethnic minorities to rise up against Russia, just to put the legitimate Russian army into even greater trouble, weaken them before the onslaught of the Bolsheviks. And so in Central Asia, they addressed the Muslims, and so they wanted them to make revolution, but remaining studiously unclear about where this revolution was going to lead. And so the slogan that they spread was Inkilab Zindabad, which is Persian or Urdu also for long live the revolution. So we cannot joke with revolution. The leaders thought they could. They thought they could choose their own time and their own methods in winning a revolution. They were sadly unaware of the socio-political dynamics and needs of a revolution. They forgot, or more correctly, they never knew, that insurrection is an art as much as war is, subject to certain rules and procedures, as Lenin said. They forgot that revolution in large measure is an engineering problem. You have to fit bits and pieces together in the correct manner, otherwise you won't get much. So a proper organization is necessary for achieving anything. Now, one of the precise engineering details you need to know about revolution, you can't suddenly magically produce a revolution. Revolutions start in specific circumstances, namely of crisis, like the democratic revolution of Kerensky and then the communist revolution of the Bolsheviks, both in 1917. They could take place in war circumstances. when Russia was in great disarray. And so generally, that's when revolutions take place. You see, there has to be a trigger for the revolution. A new revolution is possible only as a consequence of a new crisis. That's also Lenin. The approach of a crisis is the clarion call of the revolution. On the other hand, the Congress leaders bewailed that crisis. They were afraid of taking an advantage of the situation. You see, what the Quit India movement would do was to attack the British when they were with their back against the wall, when they were totally on the defensive against the Japanese. Whereas more cynical and usually also more successful political leaders would precisely take an advantage of the situation. We have another problem of lack of realism. We already saw a lack of realism in the beginning. Well, here is it again. Any activity, in order to be effective, must be trained and informed technically. It is not sufficient to depute one to do a job. It is equally necessary to train him to execute that job. And so there was no preparation of the Quit India movement. You see, everybody, wherever he was, a student, a worker, and so on, just had to drop everything and start agitating. Now, you can, of course, if you want to like vent feelings of dissatisfaction, that's there, you can do that. But if you really want to change the power equation, then that's not good enough. So in the absence of these requisites, the slogan "do or die," this is famously a slogan by Mahatma Gandhi himself, the slogan "do or die" would generally end in one's dying only instead of one's doing anything. See, now this is one of these wonderful phrases that Ram Swarup was so good at. You know, the slogan "do or die" would generally end in one's dying only instead of one's doing anything. You just savor the beauty of that sentence. Okay, so those who gave the people this slogan without giving them proper training were butchers, not martyrs. Death, even when it is in martyrdom, is an ugly thing, though unfortunately due to group greed and group domination, sometimes unnecessary. So yes, you see, he's not for total non-violence. He accepts that violent things can happen in a revolution, even dying, but this should be, treated with caution. This should not be courted frivolously. But it is the duty of the recognized leadership, as Maulana Azad, one of the Congress leaders, describes himself and his colleagues, namely as a recognized leadership, to minimize the chances of death consistent with the realization of the goal. If the goal is very important, then death may be considered. If the goal is rather frivolous, then death is a bit of overkill, so to speak. But perhaps the recognized leadership did not think that way. There are people who seem to revel in death. And this perhaps is an allusion to Mahatma Gandhi. They are people of very unhealthy and unnatural instinct. They talk big and make tall promises and held out impossible hopes. We're almost there. Then, about Nehru's internationalism. He also remarks that many people, not only Nehru, never talk realistically or technically about international politics, but only moralistically. This again is one of the problems you get when you're in opposition for too long. So at one point, you see, Nehru gets an offer to meet Benito Mussolini. Now, at that time, that was not a monster the way he became post-war. And anyway, we can agree that Mao Zedong was a monster given the many millions he killed. And Nixon, even President Nixon of the United States, even though a firm anti-communist, nevertheless went to China to talk with Mao. So similarly, Nehru could well have maintained all his criticisms of Mussolini, yet talk to him. You know, that's what mature statesmen do. And so, you see, at that point, he was not up to that. So, according to Swarup, Congress leadership and not the nationalist people, like himself and like most activists in this movement, and particularly Jawaharlal, were responsible for all this international fuss. They said, we hate imperialism, but we hate fascism more. Which means that first we have to attack the Japanese, the Germans, and only later can we do something about British colonialism, which was the usual theme. This was untrue both as a matter of fact, as far as people were concerned. Most people in India had absolutely never heard of, you see, the German regime, the Japanese regime, what they were doing. You know, this was beyond them. Even newspapers at the time were a very urban phenomenon. Was the literate people who read them were a minority, and so most people didn't know anything about this, also didn't care, because they knew that, you see, life is a difficult affair. If the Japanese in China are killing people, yeah, well, that's too bad, but we have our massacres also. And so therefore, you see, none of this is a reason to postpone independence. So at the level of the masses, it was simply not true that fascism was hated more than imperialism. Though, between brackets, I'm not too sure that the people hated imperialism either. You see, there has been a calculation sometime recently that some huge percentage of the Indian population had never seen a Britisher in their lives. You see, all these village people where the British never came, they never saw British people. And then you have in the cities, you see very many people made their peace with the British control. I mean, for them, if it is the British or the Mughals or some Maharaja, didn't make very much difference. Because after all, unlike the Sultanate, for example, the British rule didn't interfere much in the lives of the people. Certainly not in the religious part. Certainly not in social relations, caste, and so on. Economically, that's a different matter. They badly hurt the Indian economy, that is of course true, and that also was consequential. But nevertheless, very many people, you know, could live with the British in power. So I don't know if the word hate is even appropriate here. Anyway, but so if the people were perhaps not always concerned with the problem of imperialism, certainly even less people cared about the problem of fascism abroad. And then as a matter of reading, that is to say, as far as the political analysis is concerned, he also thought this was not true. Now here, there is something that does not appear in the booklet, and that in fact, even till today, very few people realize. That is, and this is something that GOEL has originally told me. Later I read a bit more about it. But it is this, that the Quit India movement was, arose as an idea in Gandhiji's mind, informed by the impression that the Japanese offensive was unstoppable and that they were about to conquer India. Indeed, GOEL told me that he was, I think, in the last year of university, and there was a professor who told the students, you know, some secret. He was letting them in on a secret, you know, great revelation, that according to the latest news he had heard, the Japanese had entered India, you know, were marching through Bengal westwards, you know, Delhi, Chalo, and that very soon they would be liberated by the Japanese. So this idea was quite alive, and it was not unrealistic. You know, the Japanese were doing very well. And so they were taking Singapore, for example, which was a real stronghold of the British. And this was the biggest empire in the world and so on. So they didn't give up like that easily. And yet, you see, the Japanese conquered it. So it was quite possible that they would conquer India. Nevertheless, at that point too, in an age, of course, where information was far scarcer than today, Gandhiji misjudged the situation. Limitations of his critique. So as I said, the post-war look on the facts makes us incomprehending of the way people looked at them when they were living through them. And so this prioritizing national over international demands seems to us a mistake on Ramsarup's part. Maybe the international dimension was more present. We do get to see a slightly different Ramsarup here at any rate. Like, you know, those who met him in person, he was a very soft person. Also, you see in his books, he's always very cautious not to, you know, offend sensibilities and so on. So here he seems to be skeptical of Gandhian nonviolence. He also, this is also perhaps strange today, but not so unusual at the time. He uses Leninist methods for non-Leninist goals, namely nationalist goals. I can think in my own country of a poet, Paul van Ostaaien, who came back from the trenches of World War I as a very firm Flemish nationalist, but at the same time as a great enthusiast for the Bolshevik Revolution. And so in slightly different political configurations as obtained back then, this combination is not so strange. But what we also see is that he spares Gandhi. He does not name Gandhi even. And at the same time, he displays a very strong contempt for Nehru, and that has remained for the rest of his life. And finally, we see the same perceptiveness in Ramswarup. He notices lots of things that others don't notice. All right, any comments or objections or so?
There are no questions, Dr. Elst, but if any panelists want to contribute or say something. Yeah, Ramakrishna ji and yes. Dr. Mahatma. Yeah. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
So, can I go first?
Yes. Ramakrishna ji first, you, and then Professor Mark can go. Yeah.
Yes. So, the question is that the Changers Club came up with all these, writings, and did the powers that we take notice of it, except for maybe GOEL's adverse review of Jawaharlal Nehru? No major notice seems to have been taken of this. Am I correct in saying this, or?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I haven't found it at any rate. Maybe I haven't systematically sought after it sufficiently, but no, I don't think that they caught the attention. But I mean, at the moment, I'm really puzzled by that part of history, because now I realize there's a lot there that we don't know. And first of all, we have to get our hands at the data, just getting our hands on these pamphlets. You know, I mean, there is interpretative history which comes later, and that's important, but that has to rest on just reliable data, and in this case, they have to be collected. Yes. Yes, there was one more question.
Yes, there was one more question by Boris. Yeah. So please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. To make sure, I like you when you say Professor Mark Joris, but I'm not a professor. Bad enough, but I'm not. But I don't blame you.
Yeah, my apologies, sir. I was not aware of that. Yeah.
I'm just joking. I'm not a professor. I wanted to ask Koen Elst. It seems strange to me that no one in Congress tried to negotiate with the British during the war, a compromise, more or less like this. Listen, Germany, that's not our problem, that's far away, but the Japanese attacking India, this is a serious thing. We want to fight them tooth and nail, we want to mobilize, but you promise us, when the war is won, you give us independence in 46 or 47, or 1 year, you don't know. But
yeah, of course.
2 years later,
yeah,
and you make an agreement.
Yeah, well, you see, that was tried. You know, it's on the 3rd of September 39, British India declared war on Germany after the motherland. And so immediately, of course, political talks started. And so Gandhi and Nehru did approach Lord Linlithgow for precisely such an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And so that didn't succeed. The British didn't concede that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, that is indeed a very reasonable proposal in the circumstances. Another one that they could have made is simply indeed to quit India, but without this movement, simply letting the war take its course, at least as they were at that point expecting, namely that the Japanese just conquer India. And so then you negotiate with the Japanese, and then you can, you know, as Indians, you know, you were in a position to convince the Japanese of something of which they were already convinced, at least at the level of propaganda, namely that they were decolonizing India. And that anyway, the Japanese and the Indian people were brothers, and there was not much difference in their culture. Like, for example, in 1938, when it was all hotting up yet, Mahatma Gandhi himself opened in Delhi the Lakshmi Narayan temple, which had been built, you know, paid for by his own financial patrons, the Birla family. And so the Japanese had made a donation to that temple, which in my time, I mean, I've visited it 25 years ago, so it was still there. I suppose it still is. Namely, a big swastika. You know, swastikas were very in at that time. And so, you know, both for the Japanese and for the Indians, it was a lucky sign. So it was appropriate. And anyway, it showed that, you know, India and Japan really have a lot in common. And so the Japanese had this propaganda of the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, in which an independent or rather independent India would fit nicely. In Burma, for example, we do see that the national leader, Aung San, the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, collaborated with the Japanese. And so he wanted to achieve some kind of independence for Burma, which the Japanese looked upon favorably, but not all the way. You see, independence under Japanese tutelage. So something like that could have been achieved for India also if the war had run differently.
May I?
Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, Koenraad, what you say, it's the chances of making an agreement with the Japanese, a decent agreement in which India was not swallowed up and not used as a slave colony, they were zero. As far I rather know the doings of the Japanese in the Second World War, in China, in Indonesia, they were, compared to them, British colonialism was an age of rationality. This was a garden party. In Indonesia, they had a big collaboration movement, which won afterwards. These guys around
Sukarno. Yeah.
Yes. They were a collaboration regime, but they paid a price I do not think Indians would be ready to pay, and no decent leader would be ready to pay. They literally sold hundreds of thousands of their own people as forced labor for the big project, industrial projects, and not a handful of them survived. If you see that the Japanese had millions and millions of prisoners of war in China, people who were they were their nephews, far more than the Indians. There was a much closer cultural and ethnical relationship between Japanese and Chinese. But of these millions of prisoners of war, in the end of the war, 50 remained. Not 50,000, 50. Someone who seriously hopes he can make a better deal with the Japanese after a victory than with the British, he's not living in this world. The Japanese regime in those days was far too convinced of his own superiority. They looked down at all the others, even all other Asian people. They thought they were the sons of the sun, and all the others were merely more than slaves.
Yeah, maybe so. Usually it's a big discussion. Like, for example, the fact that India was far more remote from Japan might have, predisposed the Japanese to take India less seriously and therefore to oppress it also less seriously. There's also the fact that beyond China, among the Tibetans, among the Mongolians, the Chinese made a lot of propaganda about Buddhist solidarity. And so that type of formula might have worked in India. It has never been tried in Tibet or Mongolia, nor in India, so we don't know exactly. So you see here, of course, I could simply say, yeah, but as I've said before, at that time people didn't know. They didn't know exactly what a possible Japanese takeover would mean. But moreover, the situation changed also in India's favor at the time when India started militarily cooperating with the Japanese. And so that's from early 1943, when Subhash Chandra Bose formed an army of Indian prisoners of war in British prisons. In Japanese prisons, I mean. So who had been soldiers in the British Indian Army. So when he formed that army, joined hands with the Japanese, then he got an undertaking from Japan that, the Indian independence and so on would be furthered by Japan also. Anyway, so that's one of the very many things that can happen in a war that change the whole situation. You see, that again is one of the messages that Ram Swarup brings here. You see, international politics is a serious business. And so with Gandhian moralizing, you can't go anywhere on a world scale. That I think at any rate is one of the very correct conclusions of this booklet.
GGG, please go ahead. You can ask your question.
Yeah, my question is related to Subhash Chandra Bose. So does Ram Swarup have any perspective on Subhash?
Actually, no, that I've never heard. In this book, however, Bose is mentioned once. in the foreword by Daya Krishna. Namely, there's a quotation of Bose that what they want is Indian independence and nothing else. That is to say, they don't care about the world situation, except insofar as it can be exploited in the service of the cause of Indian independence. And so, you know, that's the story of Bose's own career. You know, he didn't go to Germany to fight on the German side. He went to the Soviet Union. But, you know, at that point, 1940, under the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, they were allies. You see, the Soviet Union and Germany were allies. And so, you know, he wanted to fight the British. And the Soviets said, well, sorry, but we're not at war with the British. You can't fight for us against England. However, our friends in Berlin, you see, they are at war with the British. So, you know, go to them. And he went there. And so, you know, and I mean, you know, his life is really, you know, is very serious and tragic and so on, but it's also very funny to read. The changes of alliances that are made. Like he fled from India using a false identity as a Sicilian nobleman. So Sicily is part of Italy, which was an ally of Germany. And so Sicily is the part of Europe where people are the darkest, where a Bengali like Subhash Bose could most possibly, you know, count as a Sicilian. Well, yeah. So, you know, okay, all these things have happened, and this is just history. I read now that Audrey Truschke, the famous anti-Hindu historian from America, writes that Bose was a Nazi collaborator. Well, yes, he was. But, you know, in the circumstances he calculated, and at that time, of course, there was no Holocaust yet and so on. But yes, you see, it was a dictatorship, of course, and it was anti-Semitic. Yes, it was. But okay, you see, for Indian interests, he thought that this was a useful alliance. So I think that it fits into Ram Swarup's reasoning here. He doesn't mention it, he doesn't give it as an example. But yes, you see, when he suggests the viewpoint that Indian independence is a worthier cause than any international struggle, then it might indeed follow that any alliance, even with the Germans, even with the Japanese, is acceptable within the framework of a policy of getting India's independence.
We have a question from the attendee, and it goes in the same spirit of Ram Swarupji's analysis of various historical figures. The question is, what is opinion of Swarupji and GOELji for Sardar Patel, Iyengar, and Iyengarji and Ambedkar?
Yeah, well, about Ambedkar, GOELji was, of course, in two minds. I think that's simply the reasonable, the sensible position. Ambedkar was a great man in some respects. He was also, well, rather foolish in other respects. I mean, for people who don't know, Ambedkar at the end of his life converted to Buddhism. Now, in Hinduism, there is no notion of conversion, and certainly not conversion to Buddhism. You see, Buddhism is just one of the many sects within Hinduism. Anyway, he conceived that as a conversion, which was clearly a Christian concept. And so, as Savarkar said, you see, his conversion to Buddhism is a short jump into the Hindu fold, because by doing that, he didn't convert to another religion, which had been a real possibility. Now, anyway, that endears Ambedkar to most Hindu nationalists. At the same time, you see his policy on dividing the castes against one another, though that's not really his policy. You see, that policy is hung from his name. They call that nowadays Ambedkarite, but the whole thing of reservations birth privileges for one caste as against another. That's a later development, really. And an earlier development also. The British started it in 1935, but at a very small scale, and so it has been blown up by Indians themselves, and not by Ambedkar. He was in favor of keeping the reservation scheme limited to 10 years. But you see, 10 years later, of course, there was no politician in India who dared to stop the system, because there were so many voters dependent on it by then. But so, yeah, I mean, they had a nuanced view. I read many Hindu traditionalists who abhor Ambedkar. That was certainly not their case. But so they had a realistic view of him. You see, he did good things, he did bad things. As a historian, of course, Goelji had to smile at Ambedkar's ideas that, the whole of ancient Indian history is a struggle between the Brahmins and the Buddhists. So that's just not true. But he was not a historian. You see, he was a lawyer. And so at that level, he had some real contributions. Also, they never made a point that I know of the fact that Ambedkar had been a collaborator. You see, Arun Shourie, a related writer, he made an issue of this. He said, okay, you see, there was this Quit India movement and other, movements for independence. Where was Ambedkar at the time? Well, this is where he was. He was the labor minister in the cabinet of the viceroy. He was a very explicit collaborator, and he also said so. He was against independence. He did not want the British to leave India. So, at that point, he was poles apart with Ram Swarup at that age. And yet I've never heard Ram Swarup say anything about it. Then the conversion in 1956 was the occasion for both Ram Swarup and SITARAM GOEL to write books about Buddhism. So that's what they did with it, positive views. Then who more did you mention?
Sardar Patel and
Well,
yeah.
Iyengar, I never heard anything about Sardar Patel, not that I know. So, he was a great patriot. He was the Indian Bismarck, as they say, the unifier of India. So that's desirable. That's a good thing. And so he should have been the Prime Minister of India. That, of course, you see, ex-Gandhians had no problem acknowledging that it is one of the great mistakes of Gandhi that he forced Nehru on India. Because before independence, the Congress rank and file was in favor of Sardar Patel as Prime Ministerial candidate. And so Nehru by vote could not have won, not at the mass level, not at the cadre level. He could never have won, except this way, Gandhi prevailed upon Sardar Patel, please withdraw your candidacy. And then Nehru won. And so then Nehru became the worst prime minister a country can imagine for all of 15 years. And so he did enormous damage, to the economy, to the world safety situation, to Hindu-Muslim relations, and so on. The less said, the better. So Sardar Patel was okay. He was not exactly what Hindu nationalists often make of him. Like, for instance, he organized the repression against the RSS after the Mahatma Gandhi murder, even though the RSS, strictly speaking, was not involved. The murderer, Nathuram Godse, was not a member anymore of the RSS. He had been. And ideologically, he essentially was still on the same wavelength, but he wanted to do politics. And at that time, the RSS was not a political organization. And any organization would not have wanted this assassination, in the sense that they knew perfectly well that this would not be without consequences for them. And effectively, if you go into the history of this assassination, this was an individual initiative. This was not the RSS doing. Right. So, but anyway, Sardar Patel was a strong leader, was a very loyal nationalist and so on. He would have been a very good thing for India as Prime Minister. But, you know, that is something on which everyone agrees, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Koenraad ji. And now we move ahead into our final leg of today's sessions. The session 4 basically is on the challenges of Christianity. And up to we are
I want to say something. Sushant, I want to say something.
Yes, sir. Please, Dr. Mukherjee. Yeah.
1942. You see, Gandhi's last successful mass movement was 1930 April to mid-31. That is beginning the salt satyagraha. First phase of a civil division movement. After it failed, after a year it just petered out. It officially, civil division movement was 1930-34. Nothing happened between 31-34. You see, it forms a part of my PhD thesis. I did a lot of field studies in Bihar also. And Bihar was one of the important theaters of this. So after 1931, Gandhi had not been able to organize any mass movement. That is one. Then 39, Subhas Bose was expelled. Twice elected, expelled. So much so that he had to leave India. He could not, the message went out very clearly from Nehru, Patel, and British government that you can't live in India, do anything. So he had to leave. Next, 40 Gandhi started individual satyagraha. Mind is individual satyagraha, not mass satyagraha, which Subhas Bose wanted, which was not allowed by Koenraad Gandhi, and that was a miserable failure. Because I've gone through the records, you know, district-wise, village-wise, all over India, and in my book on peasant movement, I have mentioned that that was a failure, and this is accepted by scholars, historians belonging to every school. That was a failure. So 1940 was a failure. Gandhi had done nothing. And then 1937, Congress ministry had come to power. They formed government in 9 provinces, but with the declaration of the war, 1939, they resigned. So Congress, whatever chance it had got to exercise political power, that had been aborted. Gave it up. So Congress was nowhere in the picture. That's very important. So what happens? And then taking advantage of this, Muslim League just started, you know, the blitzkrieg operation, anti-Congress, those red pamphlets that Congress, the Hindu party, is persecuting Muslims, is imposing Urdu, is making Bande Mataram compulsory, all kinds of things, dirty tricks, the kind of things which are said about BJP government now. Muslim League started doing the same thing against the Congress. Congress couldn't come out of it. So Nehru and Gandhi started this policy of what? Building up nationalist Muslims, you know. Even that was a miserable failure. And as we all know, that Maulana Azad was not a true nationalist Muslim, because that is an absurdity. He was very much a Devandi Mullah. I have written on that. His concern was how to preserve, maintain the presence of Muslims, how to keep them isolated, keep them safe. He had no genuine national interest. Now, what happens? Now, Muslim League resolution at Lahore 1940, Pakistan resolution has been passed. Again, Congress could do nothing about it. So, critical phase of India's history, mid-1931 to 41, Congress was actually doing nothing. And this is where Subhas Bose's flight to Germany is very important. Because, and this is I read in various places, in various books, and also this is my hunch, because I have gone through the entire record, either in the British archives in England or India also. Subhas Bose was just taking that advantage. He went to Germany, and then by 1943, he will move on to South Asia. But in the meantime, the overall impression in India was that Congress in India, led by Gandhi, Nehru, had not been able to achieve anything on the anti-British front. So basically 1942 Quit India movement was just a cheap tactics to take the wings out of the sails of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Think over it, because I have thought over it, not because we are all admirers of Subhash Chandra Bose as a Bengali. I've recently written an article on INA, Subhash Chandra Bose. And not only me, lots of people, they hold the same opinion. Now, you see, in India, as Koenraad Elst, we all know, to write objective history is so difficult. No one supports you. You don't get state funding. So, and you're not published, your book is not reviewed. But if you think of it very coolly, that actually this is a desperate move by Gandhi to take the winds out of the sails of Subhash Chandra Bose. Look, sitting in India, we have not been able to achieve a single thing. In fact, reverses after reverses Congress, ending with the Muslim League thing. They couldn't do a thing. In the government for 2 years, 1937, 39, Congress could have done something. They're doing something, but they gave up the chance. I don't say the Congress ministry didn't do a good job, but they could have done more. But overall scenario was that Congress can't do a thing. Whereas you have thrown out this man, he's doing so much and all on his own and fighting the most powerful empire in the world. So this is very important. I see, I have taught about 1940. I also wrote a long speech on Quit India for a lecture I gave in Madras University a few years back. But the person head of the department was very interested. I should come and talk to them. But when I sent the paper, he never published that, never acknowledged that, because he's so scared, to write these things. He's a good friend of mine. He insisted that I must come and be the chief guest. The governor was there. Everyone was there. I was the first speaker. But then he suddenly said, "Oh, please, I can't publish your paper." He said, "Our prime minister is going to come. He's going to release a book. Keep quiet." So this, think over it. Think over it. I'm not pushing a particular line. It's very logical, very sound. You can't do a thing. You take the biggest part. You have thrown out the most successful president of India. 2 terms Congress president, you threw him out. But what are you doing? What is your achievement? You can't tackle Muslim League. You couldn't tackle them. They are a minority party. What have you done with them? Nothing. Because you see, let's be very frank. Gandhi was collaborating with the British from South African days. That's true. And Nehru and Bose were once upon a time seen as very close, the left group. You see the official records, they're always called the leftist. Fine, not communist. So Bose and Nehru were the best of friends 1920s, 1930s. But gradually, Nehru did the trick. He said Bose's line would not do because they didn't have the capacity to fight the British, which Bose did. And if you read Bose's observations on Gandhi and Nehru, he said, I find Gandhi more dangerous than British are. Gandhi was collaborating and Nehru also did that. So actually it's good that Subhash Bose had to leave India. Otherwise he would be killed here. Whether 1942, whether really died or he was killed subsequent. I'm not going into that. So these are important. Okay. Somehow I also knew Ramswarup very, very well, but somehow I didn't know about this book, So I will now try to find this book. Of course, the book will be there and see if I can rewrite my piece on 1942. Because you see,
okay.
Yeah. So these are certain very basic issues which you must keep in mind. The time frame is very important. Who is doing what? And so this is what step by step, year by year.
Yeah.
Province by province, you go look at the record, jail records. Who are going to jail? For a number of people who are participating, that's very important. And then and you look at the writings of Nehru.
So Radindo, it is only in the interest of the next 2 speakers that I ask you to leave it here. But it's an important remark. We have to work further on that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Sindhuji, for that insight.